I born in the t-shirt under the tree. We don't write the story in the book, with the pen. We painting with the story. We paint the land, our country. Separate story. Grandfather's country.
As the oldest surviving culture in the world, created over 60,000 years ago, Indigenous Australian dreamings were traditionally represented ephemerally, imprinted on natural surfaces such as bark, sand, or on the body, soon to be lost to time. However, a shift in this medium in 1971 to more permanent contemporary materials transformed this frontier in art and culture forever. From 1971 to 1972, at the Papunya Reserve in Central Australia, a critical period of Indigenous Australian cultural preservation took place. Through the unintentional gathering of a small pioneering group of Indigenous Australian artists, a widespread shift in artistic medium from natural surfaces to permanent board eventually resulted in the rise to prominence of the Papunya Tula art movement. This concerted shift to a new medium transformed their art into a permanent form that could be presented and sold to a wider audience. Against the immense forces of colonization and assimilation, the artists of Papunya preserved their people, their land, and their cultural stories through art, crossing a pivotal frontier in Indigenous Australian cultural preservation and changing the face of contemporary art forever. The Papunya Tula art movement, crossing the frontier from ephemeral Indigenous Australian art to cultural preservation. Since the British colonization of Australia in 1788, Indigenous Australians have faced outright discrimination and the loss of their land, rights, and way of life. Similar to the forced destruction and assimilation of Native Americans throughout U.S. history through policies that resulted in tragedies such as the Trail of Tears and the Native American boarding schools, the Australian government attempted to assimilate the Indigenous population by resettling them into government-mandated reserves and molding them into the dominant white culture. With over 80% of their population decreasing from 1788 to 1970, Indigenous Australians faced the erasure of their culture and suffered the forcible removal of children from their families. In fact, up until the 1967 referendum, Indigenous Australians were not considered citizens of their own country. In 1860, drought and the encroaching pastoral industry pushed more Indigenous Australians out of the desert and onto reserves. In 1959, Papunya was set up to resettle Indigenous Australians. In the early 1970s, Papunya attracted over 1,500 people to the reserve, more than twice the amount it was meant to contain. Groups speaking different languages, practicing different customs, and sometimes even warring tribes were forced together in unfamiliar and confronting circumstances. The true intentions of the Australian government's actions were unbeknownst to many Indigenous people. They came in because they were hungry. They didn't know they could not go back. Arriving from several distinct areas of Central Australia, the Indigenous people came with dreaming stories specific to their land and tribe. The immense cultural variety in such a densely populated area led to serendipitous cultural transactions between different tribes that were eventually translated onto canvas. The artists began painting to assert their unique cultural identity. This intense gathering of ideas and merging of stories demonstrated a diversity and profoundness in Indigenous Australian art that the world had never seen before. In 1971, Geoffrey Barton, a Caucasian schoolteacher from Sydney, Australia, came to teach art to the Indigenous children at the Papunya school. Noticing their cultural designs on the sand, Barton realized they had an entire complex culture that was yet to be recognized. Barton encouraged the children to paint their designs on paper, inspiring some Papunya men to want to paint as well. This eventually led to the now famous Honey Ant mural, which boldly represented Indigenous agency in the reserves. Barton facilitated this artistic development with supplies and space, helping to define an important moment in the history of the Papunya Tula art movement.
The men came to him and said, could you please help us? We would like to paint our stories. Can you help us with some of the paints and things that, you can give us, and we will show you by painting for you what we know about our dreaming.
The efforts of Geoffrey Barton can be compared to the pioneering work of Dorothy Dunn at the Santa Fe Indian School in New Mexico from 1932 to 1937. She insisted her art students cultivate their own Native American art style. Pushing against decades of cultural assimilation policies, Dunn may have played a crucial role in the development of the art movement in Santa Fe, but the artists revolutionized their form of Indigenous art. Although Geoffrey Barton was an integral part of Papunya, the determination and talents of the artists sustained the movement. Amid the casual racism of Australian society, it was undoubtedly easier to accept a hero named Jeff than one named Jangala, Japaljari, Japangati, or Jungurai. Among the artists, Kapa Jampit Jimpa played a crucial role in the Papunya Tula art movement. Prior to Barton's arrival in 1971, Kapa had already painted on more permanent found objects. His surprise win at the Caltech's Northern Territory Art Award in 1971 marked a critical juncture at which Indigenous Australian art gained official recognition, elevating Kapa's role in the crossing of this artistic and cultural frontier. This recognition confirmed for Kapa and the other artists of Papunya that their art had value and was appreciated by an outside audience. The symbols in Indigenous art demonstrate their connection to nature. U-shaped symbols around a concentric circle could represent a group of people sitting around a fire or water hole. Other symbols could represent animal tracks. Excited by the prospect of expressing who they were, where they came from, and potential financial gain, the artists produced over 1,000 paintings during this intense period of creativity between 1971 and 1972.
It's more better we do painting on big canvases. Because if we do body painting, none is disappeared, none is wrong. Even on the sand painting, when we do sand painting, sand is disappeared again, because wind blow and it's destroyed. While on the canvas, it's now for us that we know it's better to show the world that we're doing the drawing on the canvas, so they can stay on the canvas for years and years.
However, the imagery on the Papunya canvases did not come without controversy. Some of the early paintings revealed sacred dreamings only meant to be passed down to initiated members within the community. It was never clear if the early paintings of Papunya involved such discussions. The language barrier between Geoffrey Barton and the artists likely caused this, as he encouraged them to create powerful paintings, which may have been misinterpreted as sacred symbols that held deep spiritual meaning. Nevertheless, many artists found ways around the controversy and continued painting dreamings and making money while respecting their cultural traditions. By using techniques such as overdotting and stippling to conceal secret designs, the artists prevented what could have easily been the downfall of the Papunya Tula art movement. The initial impact of the movement led to the formation of a business cooperative. With Indigenous artists elected to leadership positions, the artists had a stake and a say in the sales of their artworks. The eventual success of the Papunya Tula Art Company inspired other Indigenous Australian artists to pursue similar endeavors. Drawn in by the paintings for their captivating complexity, this art form has defied tribal or ethnic labels and has gained the attention of museums and contemporary art collectors. The widespread recognition of this art form today allows for a new generation of Indigenous Australian artists to continue their work, critically supporting communities and families financially while preserving their cultural stories for generations to come.
The National Gallery in Canberra is the new owner of a painting by Clifford Possum Japaljari, which sold for $2.4 million overnight, a world record price for Aboriginal art.
And final call at $2 million to buy a 158.
Demonstrating the viability of this new artistic frontier, in 2007, an Indigenous Australian painting by Papunya Tula artist Clifford Possum Japaljari sold for 2.4 million Australian dollars. This moment marked a significant public recognition of this art form's artistic excellence and cultural value. The Papunya Tula art movement arose out of the ashes of colonization, where the remnants of the oldest surviving culture lay damaged by decades of oppression. With their land taken from them, their nomadic lifestyle was usurped by the promise of a better life. The collective actions of a group of Indigenous Australians putting brush to canvas over a 2-year span created an art movement that revolutionized the trajectory of their history as well as art itself. Through the Papunya Tula art movement, Indigenous Australian artists managed to survive and thrive despite the racism against Indigenous people. Against all the odds, Indigenous Australian art has become a frontier to showcase their unique world's view while preserving their dreamings in a form that transcends language and time.